You probably remember it as a harmless bedtime story, a sweet little tale your parents read to you when the world was still soft, safe, and unbroken. The Girl in the Red Hood, The Handsome Prince, The Sleeping Beauty. Pick your favorite, it doesn't matter. They all begin the same way, once upon a time. It's a promise of comfort, a signal that you're about to be guided into a world where good wins, evil loses, and everyone gets to go home by the final page. But history is a treacherous thing. It hides barbed wire beneath silk ribbons, and if you peel back the paper-thin smiles in those fairy tale illustrations, strip away the pastel skies and rosy-cheeked princesses, you'll find a story so much worse than you ever imagined. The first time you heard this tale, you probably imagined the world inside it as brighter than reality. The air was cleaner, the forests were magical, the cottages were cozy. That's the trick fairy tales play. They make the setting seem like a painted backdrop, not a living, breathing, rotting place. The original author knew better. They didn't live in a glittering kingdom. They lived in a Europe where winters froze fingers black, where wolves weren't metaphors. They were hungry, fur-matted shadows that could pull a child into the tree line before her mother even noticed she was gone. In the earliest telling of this story, before it was trimmed for children, there was no such thing as a neat ending. The wolf didn't always get killed. The girl didn't always get rescued. Sometimes she disappeared entirely, her red hood just another splash of color on the snow. And here's the thing, this story wasn't invented. It was remembered. Somewhere in the mid-1600s, in a small hamlet pressed against the edge of a forest, a girl vanished. Her name, if it was ever written, has been erased by time. But she wore something bright enough for the neighbors to recall. A crimson shawl, gifted by her grandmother, dyed with rare madder root. They said she was on her way to bring food to her grandmother, who lived deep in the woods. They said she was last seen by a man who had been chopping wood on the trail. They also said the man had eyes like glassy stones and hands, too clean for someone who worked the forest. Her body was never found. Days later, children whispered about strange tracks by the riverbank. Not paw prints, not quite boots, something in between. You see, parents in those days didn't need to keep their children entertained, they needed to keep them alive. A tale like this was not born for pleasure. It was a warning disguised as entertainment. Stay on the path. Don't talk to strangers. Never wander alone. Over the years, the warning grew teeth. The wolf became a literal animal in some tellings, a man in others. By the 18th century, French and German storytellers had already sanded down the details, making it safe for polite living rooms. The original, it had no magical huntsman to set things right. The girl was eaten, or worse, sometimes she was tricked into eating her own grandmother. Before realizing what she'd done, children were told this so they'd carry the lesson for life. The world does not wait for the innocent to learn. The ominous symbols. You might think the red hood was just a cute accessory, but in older traditions, red meant two things: blood and warning. It was the color of life and death, hunting flags, executioners' hoods. In certain parts of Eastern Europe, red cloth was also worn by plague survivors, marking them as touched by illness. The grandmother in the story, she may not have been an old, sweet bread baker in the original. It's possible she was an outcast, living far from the village, because she was suspected of carrying something contagious. And if you think wolves fear disease, you're wrong. The things left out. When folklorists began collecting these stories in the 19th century, they had to make them marketable. You couldn't sell a book to Victorian parents that began with a starving man dragging a child into the woods and ended with him leaving her bones in a hollow tree. So they cut the marrow out, replacing it with soft, sanitized flesh. The huntsman, the all-swallowed whole version of the wolf's stomach, the happily ever after. They left the bones out, but the bones are still there if you know where to look. The forest as it was. Forget the watercolor illustrations you've seen. The forests of Europe in the 1600s were nothing like the polite parks we know today. They were vast, wet, and full of things that could kill you before morning. Bandits, wolves, sickness carried by strangers. Travelers spoke of thin places in the woods where sound seemed to vanish and the air felt colder. Places where, if you stood still too long, the birds would stop singing. The girl in red passed through one of these places. That much we know. Whether she met a man, a wolf, or something older than both, we can't say. The first night, on the evening she disappeared, the village bell tolled late. By torchlight, men searched the paths with dogs. Women kept the hearths burning and prayed for dawn. When the first snow fell, came with a bitter wind that carried the smell of wood smoke. And something else. Something sweet and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. A farmer found scraps of red cloth snagged on the blackthorn bushes. The trail ended in a hollow where the snow had melted into dark, wet patches. No one went back there after nightfall. The official search ended after 10 days. By then, the men of the village had stopped carrying torches into the forest at night. They told themselves the girl must have been taken far away, maybe to another town. Maybe she had run off, but no one really believed that. They knew the woods kept what they took. When the tale became a pattern. A year passed and another child vanished. A boy this time sent to deliver firewood to his uncle's hut. He never arrived. The villagers whispered again about wolves, but the dogs never howled. It wasn't just here. Across rural France and Germany, similar tales began surfacing. Always a young traveler. Always alone. Always swallowed by the forest. The brothers Grimm would later bundle these vanishings into neat stories. They gave the wolf a name, a role, and a punishment. The truth was messier. In some villages, people swore there was no wolf, only men who wore its skin. One version of the original tale, recorded in the Auvergne region of France, doesn't even mention an animal. Instead, it speaks of Le Garçon de la Forêt, the boy of the forest. A man-shaped thing pale as ash, who waited until you were far from the village to show himself. Some swore it was a hermit gone mad. Others whispered it was no man at all, but something the forest had made from bones and bark. The only consistent detail? He smiled too much. In the earliest surviving versions, the story doesn't end with the girl's rescue. Instead, it ends with a bargain. The wolf or man offers the girl a choice. She can join him, leave the world of her village forever, and never know hunger again. Or she can run, knowing he will follow, and knowing the forest has no end for those who don't belong. The storyteller never says what she chooses, but when this tale was told to children, the fire would be left to burn low, and the adults would stare at the embers for a long time before speaking again. By the time Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected the story in the early 1800s, Europe was shifting, cities were growing, literacy was spreading, and tales were no longer just passed from fire to fire. They were printed, bound, and sold. The real stories, raw and cruel, didn't sell well to the middle class, so the Grimms kept the Red Hood, kept the wolf, kept the grandmother, but they made the huntsman the hero. Invented whole scenes to soften the blow. They wanted morality, not horror. They wanted obedience, not fear. But fear is the truer teacher. Local archives in a handful of French villages still carry records from the 17th century, buried in brittle parchment, ink faded almost to nothing. A coroner's note from 1643 describes a small female, unrecognizable, found in the hollow of a blackthorn grove. The cause of death was consumption, an old term for wasting away. But the note adds, flesh missing from limbs, no sign of burial. A priest's letter from 1651 warns parents to keep children from the paths near the river after dusk. It mentions a creature, neither beast nor man, who takes them. These are not fairy tales. They are reports. There's a superstition, still alive in rural pockets of Europe, that if you wear red in the forest at dusk, you draw the attention of things that shouldn't see you. Some say it began because of hunters. Red made you visible, but it also marked you as prey in the eyes of predators. Others believe it's older, that red is the color of blood offered willingly, a signal to ancient spirits that you are part of the bargain. The girl in the original story, she wore her grandmother's red shawl because it was warm. But in the wrong part of the forest, warmth can be a beacon. Little Red Riding Hood is not unique. Many cultures tell a version of the innocent devoured story. In Japan, it's the Yamauba, the mountain witch who lures travelers with the promise of shelter and then eats them. In Russia, it's Baba Yaga, the old woman with iron teeth who lives in a hut on chicken legs. In Italy, it's La Lupa, the she-wolf who takes children under the full moon. The faces change, the endings shift, but the message is always the same. The world beyond the path is watching you. Even today, in parts of Eastern Europe, parents tell their children not to stray into certain woods, not because they believe in fairy tales, but because they believe in patterns. Strangers still disappear. Trails still twist in ways they shouldn't. Every once in a while, a hiker is found days later, barefoot and silent, unable to explain where they've been. They speak of a man or an animal or a voice, but never the same details twice. The worst truth about this fairy tale isn't the violence. It's that it might not be a fairy tale at all. Every myth starts somewhere in a place with a name, with an incident someone tried to warn others about. Over time, the warning becomes a story. The story becomes entertainment. And once it's safe enough to tell your children before bed, the real danger is already forgotten. But danger doesn't vanish because you've stopped speaking of it. Here's one last thing that rarely survives in the written versions. In some oral tellings, the wolf does not kill the girl. Instead, she becomes his helper, learning to lure others from the path, wearing her red hood so they recognize her and follow. They say sometimes she still walks the trails, basket in hand, smiling at strangers. If you see her, they say, don't speak, don't follow, and whatever you do, don't let her lead you into the trees.